may run over the 5 minutes, but I will do my best. I need audience participation for this. If I say apartheid, how many of you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Awesome. If I say FGM, how many of you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. If I say widowhood, how many know what I'm talking about? Somewhat of an informed audience, but still, we're working on it. We have a very informed audience, actually. The human rights issue of widowhood remains elusive to our global consciousness, despite the fact that it impacts over 300 million women, and 115 million of them live in abject poverty as a direct result of their widowhood status. Apartheid affected 33 million and FGM 200 million, so you can see the magnitude of the issue. Part of the problem with widowhood is really understanding the definition of a widow. There's the de facto widow whose husband is deceased. But how do you define husband? Is it through a legal or statutory marriage, in which case it's quite straightforward. But if it's a cultural marriage, as most weddings and marriages are in the Global South, is there a marriage certificate? Is it a registered marriage? If there's no marriage certificate, how do we collect a death certificate? And then what about the functional widow whose husband has disappeared? If he's abandoned her, maybe voluntarily or involuntarily. If it's an involuntary missing situation, is it because of state or non-state actors? And at what point do we call him permanently missing, issue documentation that allows the widow to move forward with inheritance or social protections? Further complicating the issue next is the issue of our own preconceived notions. In fact, 53% of widows that we work with in the developing world, in Egypt, for example, are under the age of 39. And in Tanzania, 100% of our widows were widowed under the age of 39, which means they are mothers of young children. And then there's the child widow, 13, 12, 10-year-old widows. Widows endure 3 types of human rights violations. The first is disinheritance. No death certificate, therefore she's not able to inherit. Immediately, she's unable to gain valuable assets, especially land, even if that's land that she brought into the marriage or land that she purchased during the marriage. She might not be able to inherit her own children, given the fact that matrilineage and patrilineage lines may actually assign higher value to the children in the estate than the widow. And then oftentimes she's actually inherited as part of the estate and married off to the husband's next of kin if there was a bride price paid. The other violation against her is discrimination. 39 countries prohibit women from inheriting, period, full stop, and 102 of them have some kind of economic institutionalized violence that prohibit her from functionally gaining her inheritance. And then there's the issue of harmful traditional practices. These are culturally condoned violent acts, usually some sort of sexual cleansing that occurs unprotected and over a course of a prolonged period of time. And that is to consummate the cleansing of the sin of the widow's, the widow's sin of her husband's death. I know. The implications of this are not pretty. And at the slide above, is this the correct slide? Can you see the implications? Loss of income, which immediately means that she's unable to service her basic needs and those of her children, as we've established. She has to remove them from school. The daughters are married off as children, propagating the cycle, and the sons become vulnerable to crime and radicalized indoctrination, for which we have proof. In terms of the discriminatory effects and impacts, she doesn't have access to justice. She doesn't have access to social protections. Oftentimes the mechanism doesn't exist or the burden of accessing it is too high. And then there's a lack of economic opportunity. With the burden of young children and limited skill sets, it's almost impossible to find dignified work. And then finally, with harmful traditional practices, the proliferation of HIV and AIDS and other diseases, ostracization, shame, fear, and the risk of being drawn into the underworld of human trafficking. In all of these instances, the widow loses her voice, and it's that loss of voice that has really kept the issue of widowhood silenced and hidden from our global consciousness for this long. What does this all mean? Well, the Global Fund for Widows, as well as our partners in the Alliance for the Last Woman First, which is a group of 40 organizations around the world working for widows' rights, believes that widowhood not only directly leads to poverty, but is deeply interconnected with nearly all of the SDGs, as the slide shows. And it's actually a complicated and tragic web of implications on the 2030 agenda by not addressing widowhood. For example, disinheritance not only leads to poverty, SDG 1, and food insecurity, poor health, poor education, child marriage, lack of access to justice, vulnerable children, SDG 10, and statelessness, SDG 8. So what do widows need? They need economic empowerment, they need equitable laws, they need criminalization of acts of disinheritance and harmful traditional practices, and they need social protections. So what are those social protections? Well, the first one that we'd like to highlight today is that of marital protections, and that falls directly in with the issue of land. Every marriage should be documented, and it should be registered in order to alleviate any ambiguity, and there should be clear and equitable succession laws. There should also be death certificates issued only to the surviving widow, and for those missing, let's define a period of time for which we call him missing when we're able to actually issue a death certificate and let the widow move on. Next. In terms of social pensions and cash transfers, these are very, very powerful in helping widows alleviate the burden of poverty. These should be non-contributory, as we talked about in the earlier sessions, non-contributory, and they should be adequate. Next, education of children. Having spoken with over 5.2 million widows through their representatives, the first social protection that they require and they ask for is keep our children in school. And so we also feel strongly about having an education fund. So let me share Namibia's success story. Namibia implemented the Married Persons Equality Act in 1996 and gave equal rights to women in marriage and eliminated the male as the head of household. The result? Namibia ranks 10th in the Gender Gap Index, better than the United States, and ranks 9 on the AU Economic Empowerment Index, SDG 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, and 16 achieved. In India, the Pension and Cash Transfer Program allowed 46 million widows to alleviate the burden of poverty, but also allowed them to have a higher social status within their community as women of means with bank accounts. And finally, Mom Knows Best in South Africa, with education support, 55% of South Africa's children benefit from it. The result, that poverty was reduced by 5%, underage pregnancy by 45%, and the destitution gap by 45%. SDG 1, 2, 3, 5, and 16 achieved. So I hope I've been able to convey the gravity and the magnitude of this elusive and yet emerging issue of widowhood, not only on its impact on global poverty, but on all of the SDGs. And I have one more final question. Will you please join me today, the Global Fund for Widows, our partners in the Alliance for the Last Woman First, the 300 million widows, the 500 million of their children, the child widow, the widows of the missing, to launch today, right now, right here, the first and only Make Widows Matter global human rights campaign, so that we can make our voices heard and that we intend to leave no one behind. Thank you very much.